The crack of gunfire echoed across the sun-baked plains as Lilian Evans watched in horror as her beloved mare crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath its heaving flank. The year was 1873, and the unforgiving wilderness of the western frontier had just become Lilian's worst enemy. "That'll teach you to keep your nose out of other people's business, Miss Evans," sneered the leader of the three bandits, his face partially concealed by a filthy bandana. He tucked his still-smoking revolver into his holster with practiced ease. "You're lucky we're not killing you too. Consider this your one and only warning." Lilian stood frozen, her traveling dress coated in dust, her wide eyes fixed on her dying horse. Sheltered as she had been for most of her 22 years, nothing had prepared her for the cruelty of outlaws who roamed these territories beyond the reach of law. The horse, her faithful Penny, had been her only companion on this ill-fated journey to join her uncle in California. "You can't just leave me here," she called out, finding her voice as the bandits mounted their horses. "We're miles from anywhere. I'll die out here," the leader laughed, a sound as dry and merciless as the landscape around them. "Should have thought of that before you witnessed our business in Tucson. Maybe someone will find you, maybe not." With a sharp whistle, he signaled to his companions and they galloped away, leaving only dust clouds in their wake. Lilian sank to her knees beside Penny, tears streaming down her face as she stroked the animal's neck. "I'm so sorry, girl," she whispered, watching as the light faded from the horse's eyes. The enormity of her situation began to press down on her like a physical weight. She was alone in the scorching Arizona territory, with only the supplies in her saddlebags, no horse, no protection, and no hope of reaching Wasco, California, where her uncle awaited her arrival. She had witnessed what she shouldn't have, a murder behind a saloon in Tucson. She had been collecting her horse from the livery when she saw it happen. The victim was a well-dressed gentleman, his killers, the same men who had tracked her for 2 days before finally catching up. As the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, Lilian gathered what she could carry from her saddlebags. Water, some dried beef, a small knife, her mother's locket, and the letter from her uncle offering her a home after her parents' deaths from fever. She had no choice but to start walking, following the rough trail westward, hoping against hope that she might encounter another traveler. Hours passed under the merciless sun. Her fair skin, despite the protection of her bonnet, began to burn. Her throat grew parched despite her careful rationing of water. By mid-afternoon, her steps had grown unsteady, her vision blurring at the edges. In the distance, heat waves distorted the landscape, creating phantom lakes that vanished as she approached. When she heard hoofbeats, Lilian thought it was another hallucination until a shadow fell across her, and a deep voice spoke. "Madam, are you all right?" She looked up, squinting against the sun to see a man on horseback. His face was obscured by the wide brim of his hat, but she could make out broad shoulders and the unmistakable silhouette of a cowboy. They shot my horse," she managed to say before her legs buckled beneath her. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. "Easy now," the man said, lowering her gently to sit in the sparse shade of a scrubby mesquite. He uncorked a canteen and held it to her lips. "Small sips, miss. That's it." As Lilian's vision cleared, she got her first proper look at her rescuer. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. A thin scar ran along his jawline, but it did little to detract from his handsome features. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raspy. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "Name's Hank O'Malley," he said, settling back on his haunches. "I'm riding for the Circle M Ranch about 20 miles west of here. May I ask what a lady like yourself is doing out here alone?" Lilian hesitated, uncertain how much to share. "Lilian Evans," she replied finally. "I was traveling to California to live with my uncle in Wasco when I encountered some trouble." Hank's expression darkened. "Bandits," she nodded, clutching her meager belongings closer. "3 of them, they. I saw something I shouldn't have in Tucson. They followed me and shot my horse." He exhaled slowly, scanning the horizon with practiced vigilance. "You're lucky to be alive, Miss Evans. These parts aren't forgiving to those on foot, especially not alone. What am I going to do?" The question escaped her lips before she could stop it, betraying her desperation. Hank stood, adjusting his hat against the sun's glare. "Well, first things first. We need to get you somewhere safe before nightfall." He glanced at his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding who was eyeing them with mild interest. "Atlas here is strong, but he's not used to carrying double. Still, we don't have much choice." He extended his hand to help her up. "I can take you as far as the next town. From there, we can figure out how to get you to California." Lilian hesitated only briefly before accepting his help. His hand was calloused but gentle, his grip firm as he pulled her to her feet. The world swayed momentarily, and she steadied herself against his arm. "Thank you, Mr. O'Malley. I have no way to repay your kindness at present, but no need for that," he interrupted, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Can't leave a lady stranded in the desert. My ma would haunt me from her grave." He led her to his horse, securing her belongings to his saddlebags before mounting with practiced ease. Then he reached down, offering his arm. "Put your foot in the stirrup there and hold onto me. I'll pull you up." With an awkward motion that reminded her how little she knew of the West despite her journey thus far, Lilian managed to settle behind him on the saddle. There was nowhere for her hands but around his waist, a proximity to a man that would have scandalized her back in Boston. "Hold tight, Miss Evans," Hank said, and she felt the rumble of his voice against her hands. "We've got a long ride ahead." As Atlas began to move, Lilian found herself pressed against the solid warmth of Hank's back, her cheek resting against rough wool despite the heat. Exhaustion swept over her like a wave, and she struggled to keep her eyes open. "Rest if you need to," Hank said, as if sensing her fatigue. "I won't let you fall." Though every proper instinct rebelled against such familiarity with a stranger, Lilian's body betrayed her. The rhythmic sway of the horse, the security of Hank's presence, and the exhaustion of her ordeal conspired together, and she drifted into uneasy sleep, hands still locked around the waist of the man who had become her lifeline in a hostile land. When Lilian awoke, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. For a moment she was disoriented, her body stiff from the unfamiliar position. Then she remembered the bandits, her horse, the cowboy who had saved her. "Welcome back, Miss Evans," Hank said without turning. "You've been asleep for a couple hours. We're making decent time, but we won't reach town before dark." Lilian straightened, embarrassed to realize she'd been leaning fully against him, her arms slack around his middle. "I apologize, Mr. O'Malley. I didn't mean to." "No need for apologies," he replied, his voice tinged with something like amusement. "You've had a trying day. Anyone would be exhausted." She looked around at the changing landscape. They'd left the flat desert behind and were now traveling through rolling hills dotted with junipers and pinyon pines. The air felt cooler, fresher. "Where are we headed?" she asked. "Small settlement called Copper Springs. It's not much, but they've got a decent inn where you can rest properly. From there, we can figure out how to get you to Wasco." Lilian fell silent, contemplating her situation. She had limited funds, certainly not enough for a new horse and supplies to complete her journey. The reality of her predicament settled heavily on her shoulders. As if reading her thoughts, Hank spoke again. "Don't worry too much about tomorrow just yet, Miss Evans. One step at a time out here is the way to survive." "You're very kind, Mr. O'Malley." He made a non-committal sound, "just doing what anyone would." "No," she said firmly. "Not anyone. Those men left me to die without a second thought." Hank was quiet for a moment. "There are good folk and bad folk everywhere, Miss Evans. Out here, the difference just shows itself more plainly." They rode in companionable silence as the sun continued its descent. Lilian found herself studying the man before her, the way he sat easily in the saddle, his occasional murmurs of encouragement to Atlas, the weathered hands that held the reins with confident familiarity. Despite her situation, she felt safe in his presence. As dusk deepened into twilight, Hank guided them off the trail toward a small clearing sheltered by a cluster of rocks. "We'll need to make camp," he explained. "Copper Springs is still a good 3 hours ride, and it's not wise to travel these trails after dark." Lillian's heart sank at the prospect of spending a night in the open, but she nodded her understanding. When Hank helped her down from the saddle, her legs nearly buckled, stiff from the long ride. "Easy there," he said, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "Take a moment to get your land legs back." While she stretched her aching limbs, Hank efficiently set about making camp. He unsaddled Atlas and rubbed him down before securing him where he could graze on the sparse grass. From his saddlebags, he produced a small pot, coffee, jerky, and hardtack. "It's not much of a dinner," he apologized, working to start a small fire, "but it'll keep your strength up." Lilian watched him work, feeling useless. "Please let me help. I may not know much about camping, but I can do something." He looked up, seemingly surprised by her offer. After a moment, he nodded. "If you're feeling up to it, you could fill this pot with water from my canteen while I finish the fire." It was a small task, but Lilian was grateful for the opportunity to contribute. As night fell fully around them, they sat on opposite sides of the small fire, the coffee pot nestled in the coals, sharing a simple meal of jerky, hardtack, and the last of Lillian's dried beef. "May I ask what takes you to California, Miss Evans?" Hank inquired after they had eaten. "It's a long journey for a lady to make alone." Lilian gazed into the flames, memories washing over her. "My parents died of fever last winter. They left enough to settle their debts, but not much else. My uncle in Wasco is my only remaining family. He owns an apple orchard there and offered me a home." "I'm sorry about your parents," Hank said quietly. "Thank you." She looked up at him. "What about you, Mr. O'Malley? Have you always been a cowboy?" A faint smile crossed his features. "More or less. My pa ran cattle in Texas. I grew up in the saddle. After he passed, I drifted west, working ranches from New Mexico to here." He poured them each a cup of coffee. "Been with the Circle M for about 2 years now." "Do you enjoy it?" He considered the question, something few people had probably asked him. "Most days. It's honest work, and I'm good with horses. The land can be harsh, but it has its own kind of beauty." He gestured to the star-filled sky above them. "You don't get views like this in the cities." Lilian followed his gaze upward and caught her breath. Without the haze of city smoke or the glow of many lamps, the night sky was a tapestry of stars, countless pinpricks of light against velvet darkness. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "That it is," Hank agreed. And when she looked back at him, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. After they finished their coffee, Hank unrolled his bedroll and insisted Lilian take it. "I'll keep watch for a while," he said, settling with his back against a rock, rifle across his knees. "Try to get some sleep, Miss Evans. We'll start at first light." Despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive. The ground was hard beneath the thin bedroll, and every unfamiliar sound of the desert night startled her. She watched Hank's silhouette against the dying firelight, drawing comfort from his vigilant presence. "Mr. O'Malley," she said softly after a long silence. "Yes, Miss Evans." "Do you think those men might come after me again?" He was quiet for a moment. "Hard to say. Depends on what you saw and who they are." He shifted slightly to look at her. "When we reach Copper Springs, it might be wise to speak with the sheriff. The law's stretched thin out here, but they do what they can." Lilian nodded, though she wasn't sure he could see the gesture in the darkness. "It was a murder," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Behind the Golden Nugget Saloon in Tucson, a gentleman in a fine suit. They shot him and took his briefcase." She swallowed hard. "I was at the livery next door collecting Penny. They saw me watching." Hank's posture tensed. "Did you recognize any of them?" "No, they wore bandanas over their faces. But one had a distinctive silver belt buckle shaped like a wolf's head. That's how I knew it was the same men who followed me." "A wolf's head," Hank repeated thoughtfully. "I'll remember that." He added more wood to the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Try to rest now, Miss Evans. You're safe for tonight." Somehow, those simple words eased her mind enough that sleep finally claimed her, the crackling fire and Hank's steady presence keeping the terrors of the day at bay. Morning came with the first tentative calls of desert birds. Lilian awoke to find Hank already up, tending a small fire over which a pot of coffee was brewing. The scent made her stomach growl, reminding her how little she'd eaten the previous day. "Good morning," he greeted her, handing her a cup of the strong brew. "How did you sleep?" Lilian accepted the coffee gratefully. "Better than I expected, thank you." She smoothed her hair as best she could, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. Her traveling dress was dusty and wrinkled, her hair falling loose from its pins. Hank, seeming to sense her discomfort, politely averted his gaze. "We should reach Copper Springs by mid-morning. Mrs. Whitaker runs the inn there. She's a good woman. She'll help you get cleaned up and find some fresh clothes." They shared a breakfast of jerky and the last of the hardtack before breaking camp. As Hank saddled Atlas, Lilian folded his bedroll with careful precision, trying to be useful. The morning ride was more comfortable than the previous day's journey. Lilian felt less awkward about holding on to Hank, and the cooler morning air made the travel more pleasant. They talked intermittently, Hank pointing out landmarks or explaining the habits of the wildlife they spotted, Lilian sharing stories of her life back east. "I've never been further east than Kansas City," Hank admitted. "What's Boston like?" Lilian thought about the city she'd called home for her entire life until 2 weeks ago. "Busy, full of brick buildings and cobblestone streets. The harbor is always bustling with ships from all over the world." She paused. "It's beautiful in its way, but very different from this." "You miss it?" The question made her reflect. "I miss what it was when my parents were alive. Our home, my friends, the familiar routines, but after they died." She sighed. "It became a place of memories more than a home." Hank nodded, understanding in his silence. By mid-morning, as promised, the settlement of Copper Springs came into view. It was small, just a main street with a handful of buildings on either side, backed by scattered houses and small homesteads. A creek ran along one edge of town, explaining its name. People stopped to stare as Hank rode in with Lilian behind him. It wasn't every day a cowboy arrived with a proper-looking Eastern lady sharing his saddle. Hank seemed oblivious to the attention, guiding Atlas directly to a 2-story wooden building with a sign proclaiming it, the Copper Springs Inn and Dining Room. He dismounted first, then helped Lilian down with careful hands. Her legs felt wobbly after the long ride, and she steadied herself against his arm. "Hank O'Malley," called a hearty female voice. "What brings you to town? and with a lady no less. A plump, gray-haired woman in a flour-dusted apron emerged from the inn, her shrewd eyes taking in Lilian's bedraggled appearance with a single glance. "Morning, Mrs. Whittaker," Hank greeted, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "This is Miss Lilian Evans. She's had some trouble on the trail. Bandits shot her horse and left her stranded. Found her walking yesterday, about half a day east of here." Mrs. Whittaker's expression shifted from curiosity to motherly concern. "You poor dear, come inside this instant. You look ready to drop." She took Lilian's arm and began guiding her toward the door, then paused to look back at Hank. "You too, young man. I've just pulled fresh biscuits from the oven, and you both look like you could use a proper meal." The interior of the inn was clean and welcoming, with a dining room to one side and a small sitting area with a stone fireplace on the other. Mrs. Whittaker led them to a table by the window and bustled off to the kitchen, returning moments later with a tray bearing coffee, biscuits, butter, honey, and slices of ham. "Eat up," she instructed. "Then, Miss Evans, I'll show you to a room where you can rest and freshen up." The food was simple but delicious, and Lilian realized how hungry she truly was. As they ate, Hank explained their situation in greater detail. Mrs. Whittaker listened with growing concern. "And these bandits," she asked Lilian, "did they say anything about why they were following you?" "Besides what you witnessed," Lilian shook her head. "Only that I should have kept my nose out of their business. They seemed more intent on frightening me than anything else." She shuddered, unable to speak aloud the other fates that might have befallen her. "Well, you'll be safe here for now," Mrs. Whittaker assured her. "Sheriff Tate is a good man. Hank, you should take her to speak with him after she's rested." "I intend to," Hank agreed, finishing his coffee. "But first, Miss Evans needs a room and some rest. And I need to send word to the Circle M that I'll be delayed." He hesitated, then added, "I plan to escort Miss Evans to Wasco once she's recovered her strength." Lilian looked up in surprise. "Mr. O'Malley, I couldn't possibly ask that of you. You've already done so much." "You didn't ask," he replied simply. "But those men might still be looking for you. I wouldn't feel right letting you continue alone." Mrs. Whittaker watched this exchange with knowing eyes. "That's settled, then. Miss Evans, come with me. I'll show you to your room and send up some hot water for washing. I might have some clothes that would fit you as well. My niece left some things when she visited last month." Lilian rose, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. "Thank you, Mrs. Whittaker. And you, Mr. O'Malley. I don't know how I can ever repay you both." "Nonsense," Mrs. Whittaker said briskly. "Now come along. You look dead on your feet." As Lilian followed the innkeeper upstairs, she glanced back to find Hank watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. Something warm fluttered in her chest. Gratitude, she told herself firmly. Nothing more. The room Mrs. Whittaker showed her to was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. Lilian sank onto the bed, suddenly aware of every ache in her body. "I'll send up hot water and those clothes," Mrs. Whittaker promised. "Rest as long as you need. When you're ready, come down for dinner. We serve at 6, but I can keep something warm for you if you sleep through." Left alone, Lilian removed her boots with a wince. Her feet were blistered from her brief walk in the desert. The thought of how close she had come to death struck her anew, and she shivered despite the warm room. A knock at the door announced a young girl with a steaming pitcher of water and a stack of folded clothes. Lilian thanked her and, once alone again, gratefully washed away the dust of the trail. The borrowed dress was simpler than what she was accustomed to, a practical calico in a soft blue, but it fit well enough and was blissfully clean. She brushed and rebraided her hair, then lay down, intending only to rest her eyes for a moment. Instead, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When Lilian awoke, the angle of sunlight through her window told her it was late afternoon. She felt refreshed, the worst of her exhaustion banished by several hours of uninterrupted sleep in a real bed. Rising, she splashed more water on her face and straightened her borrowed dress before heading downstairs. The dining room was empty save for Hank, who sat at a corner table nursing a cup of coffee and reading what appeared to be a newspaper. He looked up at her approach, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "Miss Evans," he greeted, rising quickly. "You're looking much better." "I feel much better, thank you," she replied, suddenly shy under his gaze. "Have you been waiting long?" "Not at all. I had some errands to attend to sent word to the ranch, spoke with Sheriff Tate." He pulled out a chair for her. "The sheriff would like to speak with you when you're feeling up to it. I told him what you shared with me, but he'll want to hear it directly." Lilian nodded, sitting down. "Of course. I want to help if I can." Mrs. Whitaker appeared from the kitchen, beaming when she saw Lilian. "There you are, my dear. Hungry? I've got a pot of stew simmering." "That sounds wonderful, thank you." As Mrs. Whitaker retreated to fetch food, Lilian turned back to Hank. "What did the sheriff say about the men who attacked me?" Hank's expression grew serious. "He thinks they might be the Larson gang. They've been operating between here and Tucson for the past year, robberies mostly, but there have been a few killings. The wolf head belt buckle you described matches what's been reported about their leader, Wade Larson." Lilian's mouth went dry. "Then they're known outlaws. Do you think they'll come after me?" "It's hard to say," Hank admitted. "If they're worried about what you saw in Tucson, possibly. That's why I think it's best if I accompany you to Wasco." Before Lilian could respond, Mrs. Whitaker returned with a tray bearing 2 bowls of fragrant stew, fresh bread, and butter. "Eat up, both of you," she instructed, setting the food before them. "Sheriff Tate said he'll stop by after his evening rounds to speak with you, Miss Evans." As they ate, Hank explained what he had arranged. "The general store has a decent saddle horse for sale, not fancy, but sound. I've examined him and he'll do for you. We can leave the day after tomorrow if you feel strong enough. It's about a week's ride to Wasco from here, keeping to a pace that won't tire the horses." "A week," Lilian echoed, thinking of the journey ahead, 7 days of riding side by side with this man she barely knew but already trusted with her life. "We'll have to camp most nights," Hank continued, misinterpreting her tone as concern. "There are a few settlements along the way where we can find proper lodging, but they're scattered. I've made a list of supplies we'll need." "Mr. O'Malley," Lilian interrupted gently, "I'm not sure I can afford a horse and supplies. My funds are limited." It was humiliating to admit, but she had no choice. The money she carried was barely enough for a stage-coach ticket, which had been her original plan before circumstances forced her to travel on horseback. Hank waved away her concern. "The Circle M owed me back wages. I've arranged to purchase what we need." "I can't let you do that," Lilian protested. "You've already done so much. I'll find another way to." "Miss Evans," he cut in, his voice firm but kind, "out here, folks help each other. It's how we survive. You can repay me when you're settled in Wasco if it eases your mind." She wanted to argue further but recognized the stubborn set of his jaw. Instead, she offered a compromise. "I insist on contributing what I can, and I will repay you in full, Mr. O'Malley. I don't take debts lightly." A small smile tugged at his lips. "I never doubted that, Miss Evans." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Tate, a tall man with a graying mustache and keen eyes that missed nothing. He removed his hat as he approached their table, introducing himself with a polite nod. "Miss Evans, I understand you've had quite an ordeal. Would you mind sharing what you saw in Tucson? Any details might help us apprehend these men." Lilian recounted the incident as clearly as she could remember the well-dressed victim, the three masked assailants, the distinctive wolf head belt buckle, the briefcase they had taken. Sheriff Tate listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Based on your description, I'm fairly certain we're dealing with the Larson gang," he confirmed when she finished. "They've been getting bolder lately. The man they killed might have been Edward Pinkerton, a bank manager from Tucson who went missing 3 days ago. He was carrying bank documents, possibly including information on gold shipments." Lilian felt cold at this information. "Then they had reason to want to silence me." Sheriff Tate nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so, madam. I'll telegraph the authorities in Tucson and the settlements between here and Wasco, but it's best if you remain cautious." He glanced at Hank. "O'Malley's one of the best men you could have watching your back. He was a scout for the cavalry before he took to ranching." This was news to Lilian, who looked at Hank with surprise. He met her gaze steadily, but offered no comment on his past. After the sheriff departed, promising to keep them informed of any developments, Lilian and Hank finished their meal in thoughtful silence. The weight of her situation had settled heavily upon her once again. "Try not to worry too much, Miss Evans," Hank said finally, seeming to read her thoughts. "The Larsons typically move east after a job, not west, and will be taking a route that avoids the main trails where possible." Lilian nodded, trying to take comfort in his confidence. "Thank you again, Mr. O'Malley. I don't know what I would have done without your help. You're a resourceful woman, Miss Evans. I suspect you would have found a way to survive." His words, spoken with simple certainty, warmed her more than they should have. Before she could respond, Mrs. Whittaker approached with coffee and 2 slices of apple pie. "On the house," she insisted when Lilian tried to protest. "You both need feeding up before your journey." As they enjoyed the unexpected treat, Lilian found herself studying Hank more closely. In the warm lamplight of the dining room, with his hat set aside and his dark hair slightly tousled, he looked younger, less weathered. The scar along his jawline, she now noticed, continued down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar, an old injury that must have been severe. "May I ask about your time as a cavalry scout?" she ventured, curiosity overcoming propriety. Hank's hand stilled momentarily as he reached for his coffee. "Not much to tell. Served for 3 years after the war, mostly tracking renegade bands and guiding supply trains." His tone suggested he wasn't comfortable elaborating, and Lilian didn't press. "I should turn in," he said after a moment, rising from the table. "We have preparations to make tomorrow. Meet me here for breakfast at 7 if that's not too early." "7 is fine," Lilian agreed. "Good night, Mr. O'Malley." "Good night, Miss Evans." He hesitated, then added softly, "Sleep well." As she watched him leave, Lilian was struck by the strange turn her life had taken in just 2 days. From certain death in the desert to planning a week-long journey with a man she barely knew but already trusted implicitly. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt something like hope. The next day passed in a flurry of preparations. Hank purchased a sturdy bay mare for Lilian from the general store owner, along with a serviceable saddle and the supplies they would need for their journey. Lilian contributed what she could from her limited funds, insisting on paying for her own clothing and personal items. Mrs. Whittaker helped her select practical attire more suited to the trail: split riding skirts, sturdy blouses, a wide-brimmed hat to protect against the sun, and a warm coat for the cool desert nights. The innkeeper also pressed upon her a small Derringer pistol. "A lady should be able to protect herself," she insisted, showing Lilian how to load and fire the small weapon. "Keep it in your pocket at all times." By evening, their preparations were complete. They would depart at first light, following a route Hank had carefully planned with Sheriff Tate's advice, avoiding the main trails where the Larson gang might be watching. Their last dinner at the inn was a subdued affair. Mrs. Whitaker had prepared a hearty meal, and several other guests joined them, curious about the pair and their upcoming journey. Lilian answered their questions politely but vaguely, following Hank's lead in not sharing too many details of their route or her reasons for traveling. After dinner, Lilian retired to her room to finish packing her few belongings. A knock at her door revealed Hank, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "Miss Evans, I wanted to make sure you're still comfortable with our plans," he said, remaining in the hallway as propriety demanded. "It's not too late to consider alternatives. The stagecoach passes through next week, or Sheriff Tate could arrange an escort of deputies." Lilian was touched by his concern. "Mr. O'Malley, I trust you more than any alternative, unless you're having second thoughts." "No," he said quickly. "Not at all. I just wanted to be sure you understand what you're agreeing to. A week on the trail isn't easy, especially for someone not accustomed to this life. I may be from the East, Mr. O'Malley, but I'm stronger than I look," she replied with a small smile, "and a quick learner." Something like admiration flickered in his eyes. "I don't doubt that, Miss Evans. Get some rest. Dawn comes early." Morning arrived with a pink-gold sunrise and the promise of a clear day. Lilian dressed in her new riding clothes, secured the derringer in her pocket, and headed downstairs to find Hank already waiting. Mrs. Whitaker had prepared a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, along with parcels of food for their first day's travel. "You take care of this young lady, Hank O'Malley," the innkeeper instructed as they prepared to depart. "And you, Miss Evans, don't let this cowboy push too hard. He forgets that not everyone was born in the saddle." With final thanks and promises to send word when they reached Wasco safely, they mounted their horses and rode out of Copper Springs just as the town was coming to life for the day. Lilian's new mare, whom she had named Willow for her gentle disposition, followed Atlas's lead willingly. "How does it feel?" Hank asked as they left the last buildings behind. Lilian adjusted her seat, grateful for the proper riding skirt that allowed her to sit astride comfortably. "Different from side saddle, but better for a long journey, I think." He nodded approvingly. "You'll be sore at first, but your body will adjust. Let me know if you need to rest. There's no shame in taking breaks." The first day's ride took them through rolling grasslands that gradually gave way to more rugged terrain. Hank kept them moving at a steady pace, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife. He was a patient teacher, showing Lilian how to read the land and sky, how to spot water sources, how to listen to her horse's needs. They stopped at midday by a small creek for a brief rest. As Lilian stretched her aching muscles, Hank prepared a simple meal from Mrs. Whitaker's provisions. They ate in companionable silence, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "Were you born in Texas, Mr. O'Malley?" Lilian asked as they packed up to continue their journey. "Born and raised," he confirmed. "My folks had a small ranch near San Antonio, nothing fancy, but we did all right." A shadow crossed his features. "Lost it during the war. Pa never really recovered." "I'm sorry," Lilian said softly, understanding loss all too well. Hank shrugged, but his eyes held old pain. "Life out here teaches you to adapt or perish. Pa couldn't adapt. I had to." They mounted up and continued westward. By late afternoon, Lilian was feeling the effects of the day's ride in every muscle. She tried to hide her discomfort, but Hank's observant eyes missed nothing. "There's a good camping spot about a mile ahead," he announced. "We'll stop there for the night." The spot he chose was sheltered by a formation of rocks, with a small spring providing fresh water. While Lilian watered the horses, Hank efficiently set up camp, building a small fire and unpacking their bedrolls. "It's not much," he apologized, gesturing to the simple setup, "but it'll keep us warm and dry. The stars make up for the lack of amenities." As darkness fell, they shared a dinner of jerky, hardtack, and dried fruit. The fire cast a warm glow over their small camp, and the desert night came alive with unfamiliar sounds. "What's that?" Lilian asked, startling at a distant, eerie howl. "Coyote," Hank replied. "They sound closer than they are. They won't bother us with the fire going." Despite his reassurance, Lilian edged closer to the flames. Hank noticed and smiled slightly. "The desert takes some getting used to," he acknowledged, "but there's a freedom out here you won't find anywhere else. No constraints of society, no one telling you who you should be or how you should live." "Is that why you stay? The freedom?" He considered the question, poking at the fire with a stick. "Partly, and partly because I understand this land. It's harsh but honest. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not." Lilian studied him in the firelight, this man who had saved her life and now spoke of the desert with something like love in his voice. "You're a philosopher, Mr. O'Malley." He chuckled, the sound warming her more than the fire. "Hardly that, Miss Evans. Just a man who's had time to think while riding fence lines." As the night deepened, they prepared for sleep. Hank insisted Lilian take the spot closest to the fire, while he positioned himself between her and the open desert, his rifle within easy reach. "Will you be comfortable?" she asked, noticing how he arranged himself on the hard ground with practiced efficiency. "I've slept on worse," he assured her. "Rest well, Miss Evans. Tomorrow will be another long day." Despite her physical exhaustion, sleep eluded Lilian. She lay watching the stars wheel overhead, acutely aware of Hank's presence just a few feet away. In Boston, being alone with a man like this would have ruined her reputation beyond repair. Yet here, in the wilderness, conventional rules seemed distant and irrelevant. "Mr. O'Malley." She whispered, unsure if he was still awake. "Yes, Miss Evans." His response was immediate, his voice clear. He hadn't been sleeping either. "Thank you, not just for rescuing me, but for all of this. For treating me like I'm capable, not just a burden." There was a pause, then he replied softly, "You're not a burden, Miss Evans, far from it." The simple words carried a weight that settled in her chest, warm and unexpected. "Good night, Mr. O'Malley." "Good night, Lilian." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the way it sounded in his voice made her heart beat faster. Foolishness, she told herself firmly, born of gratitude and the strange intimacy of their situation. Nothing more. Yet as she finally drifted toward sleep, Lilian couldn't help but wonder if perhaps it was something more after all. The next several days fell into a rhythm. They would rise with the dawn, share a simple breakfast, and ride until the heat of midday forced them to rest. After a brief meal and rest, they would continue until late afternoon, when Hank would select a campsite for the night. Their evenings were spent in conversation around the campfire, learning about each other's lives and sharing stories of their pasts. Lilian learned that Hank had a younger sister living in San Francisco with her husband, that he had a talent for whittling, and that he could identify virtually every plant and animal in the territories they traversed. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Boston, her love of literature, and her dreams of someday opening a small school. Each day, the distance between them seemed to shrink, not just physically but emotionally. Lilian found herself watching Hank when he wasn't looking the way the sun brought out golden highlights in his brown hair, the ease with which he moved in this harsh landscape, the rare but transformative effect of his genuine smile. On the fourth day of their journey, they encountered the first real challenge. A summer storm rolled in unexpectedly, turning the sky an ominous green-gray and bringing with it driving rain and wind that bent the desert scrub double. "We need shelter," Hank shouted over the gathering storm, scanning the horizon. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles west. If we push hard, we can reach it before the worst hits." They urged their horses to a canter, racing against the darkening sky. Thunder cracked overhead, and Willow shied nervously. Lilian, growing more confident in the saddle with each passing day, steadied the mare with a firm hand and soothing words. The line shack came into view just as the first heavy drops began to fall, a small, weathered structure nestled against a rocky outcropping. They dismounted quickly, and Hank led the horses to a lean-to attached to one side of the shack while Lilian gathered their saddlebags. The interior was dusty but sound, with a small fireplace, a crude table and chair, and a narrow cot. Hank quickly got a fire going while Lilian shook out their damp blankets and hung them near the flames to dry. Outside, the storm raged, rain pounding against the wooden walls and wind howling around the corners of the small structure. Lilian shivered, grateful for the solid roof over their heads. "You're soaked through," Hank observed, concern in his voice. "You should change into dry clothes before you catch a chill." Lilian glanced around the one-room shack, acutely aware of the lack of privacy. Hank, understanding her dilemma, immediately moved toward the door. "I'll check on the horses," he said. "Take your time." Left alone, Lilian quickly changed into her spare set of clothes, hanging her wet garments near the fire to dry. She had just finished when Hank knocked on the door. "Decent," he called. "Yes, come in." He entered, bringing with him the smell of rain and a gust of cold air. He was drenched, water dripping from his hat and coat. "The horses are settled," he reported, removing his hat and shaking it off. "This storm's set to last a while, I'm afraid. We might be here until morning." "At least we have shelter," Lilian said, trying to sound cheerful despite the implications of spending a night confined in such close quarters. Hank nodded, struggling with his wet coat. Lilian stepped forward to help him, tugging the sodden garment from his shoulders. Their hands brushed, and she felt a jolt that had nothing to do with the lightning flashing outside. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice oddly rough. Lilian busied herself hanging his coat near the fire, suddenly very aware of his presence in the small space. When she turned back, he had removed his outer shirt as well, leaving him in just his undershirt, which clung to his broad shoulders and chest. She quickly averted her eyes, a flush rising in her cheeks. I should see what food we have," she stammered, moving to their saddlebags. They made a simple meal of jerky, dried apples, and the last of Mrs. Whittaker's bread, which had gone slightly stale but was still edible. The cramped quarters forced them to sit close together on the floor near the fire, their knees almost touching. "Storm's getting worse," Hank observed as thunder shook the small shack. "Glad we found this place when we did." Lilian nodded, trying not to jump at each crack of thunder. "Do these storms last long? Desert storms. They can blow through quick or linger for a day. No telling." He studied her face. "You don't like thunder, is it that obvious?" she asked with a small, embarrassed laugh. "You flinch every time." His voice was gentle, free of mockery. "Everyone's afraid of something." "What are you afraid of, Mr. O'Malley?" The question slipped out before she could consider its propriety. He was quiet for so long that Lilian thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said softly, "Failing those who depend on me. Watching someone I care about suffer and being unable to help." He stared into the fire, shadows dancing across his features. "I've had enough of that for one lifetime." The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep inside her. Without thinking, Lilian reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry into painful memories." Hank looked down at her hand, then up at her face. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "You're not prying," he assured her. "It's just been a long time since I've talked about anything that matters, I suppose." A particularly loud thunderclap made Lilian start, her hand tightening on his arm. Hank covered her hand with his own, warm and reassuring. "It's all right," he said softly. "We're safe here." They remained like that for a moment, connected by that simple touch, while the storm raged outside. Lilian was acutely aware of his nearness, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the surprising gentleness of his calloused hand covering hers. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like you to call me Lilian. Miss Evans feels unnecessarily formal after all we've shared." His eyes, that stormy blue-gray that had first caught her attention, searched her face. "Then you should call me Hank." "Hank," she repeated, testing the name on her lips. It felt right, as if she had been waiting to say it all along. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something neither had acknowledged. For a breathless moment, Lilian thought he might lean closer, might bridge the small distance between them. Instead, he gently withdrew his hand and stood, moving to the window to peer out at the storm. "You should take the cot," he said, his back to her. "I'll be fine on the floor by the fire." Lilian felt a confusing mix of disappointment and relief. "Are you sure? We could take turns." "I'm sure." His voice was kind but firm, closing the subject. As Lilian settled onto the narrow cot, pulling a blanket over herself, she watched Hank arrange his bedroll near the fire. The small shack, isolated in the midst of the storm, created an illusion of being the only two people in the world. It was both comforting and terrifying, this growing awareness of him not just as her protector, but as a man who stirred feelings she had never experienced before. "Good night, Hank," she said softly. He glanced over, his face half illuminated by the firelight. "Good night, Lilian. Sleep well." But sleep was long in coming, her mind too full of confusing thoughts and her body too aware of his presence just a few feet away. Morning brought clear skies and a fresh, rain-washed world. They set out early, eager to make up for lost time. The landscape had been transformed by the storm. Normally dry creek beds now ran with swift currents. Desert flowers had sprung to vibrant life overnight, and the air held a clean, fragrant quality that made breathing a pleasure. "It's beautiful," Lilian marveled as they rode side by side through a valley where wildflowers carpeted the ground in splashes of yellow, purple, and white. "This is the desert's secret," Hank replied, smiling at her wonder. "Most folks only see the harshness, the danger. They miss moments like this." Their conversation flowed more easily than before, the awkward awareness of the previous night giving way to a comfortable familiarity. They spoke of their hopes for the future, Hank's dream of someday having his own small ranch, Lilian's desire to create a life of meaning in her new home. "Your uncle, does he expect you to marry soon?" Hank asked suddenly as they stopped to water the horses at a rain-swollen creek. The question caught Lilian off guard. He hasn't said as much. Why do you ask?" Hank shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "Just curious. Most families have expectations for young women your age." "My parents did," Lilian admitted. "They had several suitable matches in mind before they died. But my uncle seems more concerned with my happiness than my marital status. His letters suggest he's quite progressive in his thinking." "And what do you want?" Hank's gaze was direct now, genuinely interested in her answer. Lilian considered the question thoughtfully. "I want a partnership. Not just a marriage of convenience or social standing, but a true meeting of minds and hearts. I want someone who sees me as an equal, who values my thoughts and abilities." She hesitated, then added softly, "I want what my parents had, a love that grows stronger with each passing year." Something flickered in Hank's eyes, longing, perhaps, or understanding. That's worth waiting for. The day passed pleasantly, the weather remaining clear and mild. By late afternoon, they had reached the foothills that marked the border between Arizona Territory and California. Hank selected a campsite on a small rise that offered a view of the trail behind them and the mountains ahead. "We'll cross into California tomorrow," he announced as they unsaddled the horses. "2 more days to Wasco, if the weather holds." Lilian felt an unexpected pang at his words. Their journey was nearing its end, and with it, their time together. The realization unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. That evening, as they sat beside their campfire sharing the last of their coffee, Lilian gathered her courage to ask a question that had been on her mind. "What will you do after we reach Wasco? Return to the Circle M?" Hank stared into the flames, considering. "I suppose so. It's a good position, and the ranch owner treats his men fairly." He hesitated, then added, "Though I've been thinking lately that it might be time for a change. Maybe look for land of my own, somewhere in California." Hope fluttered in Lilian's chest, but she kept her voice neutral. "California has much to offer from what I've heard." "So I'm told," Hank agreed, glancing at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Your uncle's orchard is at large. He writes that it's modest but profitable. 20 acres of apple trees, a small vineyard, and some vegetable gardens, enough to support him comfortably and employ a few workers." "Sounds peaceful," Hank mused. "A good place to put down roots." "Yes," Lilian agreed softly. "I think it will be." They fell into a companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire burned low and stars filled the sky above them. Finally, Hank spoke again, his voice quiet but clear in the still night. "Lilian, there's something I should tell you about my past." She turned to him, surprised by the serious tone. "You don't owe me any explanations, Hank." "Maybe not, but I want you to know." He drew a deep breath. "After the war, when I was riding with the cavalry, I did things I'm not proud of. The army wasn't always righteous in its dealings with the native tribes. I followed orders that I knew in my heart were wrong." Lilian remained silent, sensing he needed to continue without interruption. "That's why I left," he went on. "Couldn't stomach it anymore. The scar I carry," he touched his jaw, "it's a reminder of the last skirmish. A Kairikahua warrior gave it to me, and he was right to fight back. We were on their land, taking what wasn't ours to take." "Is that why you became a rancher?" Lilian asked gently. "To find peace?" Hank nodded. "Wanted to live honestly. Work with the land, not against it or its people." He looked at her directly. "I'm not the hero you might think I am, Lilian, just a man trying to do better than he's done before." Without hesitation, Lilian reached across the space between them and took his hand. "That makes you more honorable, not less. Recognizing past wrongs and seeking to right them, that takes courage." His fingers tightened around hers. "You see the best in people." "I see you, Hank O'Malley," she said simply. "A good man who saved my life and has treated me with nothing but respect and kindness." Their eyes held across the dying fire, words unnecessary in the understanding that passed between them. When Lilian finally withdrew her hand and bid him good night, it was with a heart fuller and more certain than it had been before. The next morning dawned clear and cool. They packed up camp efficiently, the routine now familiar after days on the trail together. As Lilian secured her bedroll to Willow's saddle, she was aware of Hank watching her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You've become quite the trail rider," he observed as they mounted up. "Hard to believe you're the same woman I found stumbling through the desert less than a week ago." Lilian smiled, pleased by his approval. "I had an excellent teacher, and necessity is a powerful motivator." They rode side by side into the foothills, the trail gradually ascending as they approached the border into California. The landscape changed subtly. More trees appeared. The vegetation grew lusher, and the air carried a hint of distant ocean despite being many miles inland. By midday, they had crossed into California, pausing at the crest of a hill that offered a spectacular view of the valley beyond. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer season. "Welcome to California, Lilian," Hank said, sweeping his arm toward the vista before them. "Your new home." The word home resonated strangely in Lilian's chest. She had left Boston believing her uncle's orchard would become her home, but now, looking at the man beside her, she wasn't so certain. Home, she was beginning to realize, might be more about who you were with than where you were. They continued their journey through increasingly fertile landscape. Occasional homesteads and small farms appeared, evidence of the settlement spreading across the region. Late in the afternoon, they encountered another traveler, an older man driving a wagon loaded with supplies. "Afternoon," he greeted them cheerfully. "Headed to Wasco by any chance?" "We are," Hank confirmed. "Is that where you're bound?" "Indeed it is. Name's Chester Wilson. I run the general store there." The man eyed them curiously. "Don't believe I've seen either of you before." Lilian introduced herself. "I'm Lilian Evans. My uncle is Thomas Evans, the apple grower." Recognition lit up Chester's weathered face. "Tom's niece. Well now, he's been talking of your arrival for weeks. Got the whole town curious about the fine Boston lady coming to live in our humble community." He tipped his hat respectfully. "And your husband?" Lilian flushed. "Oh, Mr. O'Malley is not my husband. He's escorting me to Wasco. We encountered some trouble on the trail." Chester looked between them, clearly drawing his own conclusions despite Lilian's explanation. "I see. Well, you've chosen a good man for protection, Miss Evans. The O'Malley name is respected in these parts." Hank looked surprised. "You know of my family. If you're related to Patrick O'Malley, who ran cattle near San Antonio, then yes. My brother-in-law worked his ranch years ago, spoke highly of the family." "Patrick was my father," Hank confirmed, a note of wonder in his voice. Chester nodded, satisfied. "Good stock, the O'Malleys. Well, I won't keep you folks. Tom's place is about 15 miles southwest of town. Can't miss it. Only orchard in the valley with a red painted barn." He gathered his reins. "Safe travels to you both." As Chester's wagon rumbled away, Lilian glanced at Hank, who seemed lost in thought. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. He nodded slowly. "Just unexpected, hearing someone speak of my father after all these years." A small smile touched his lips. "It's a good feeling, knowing his name is remembered with respect." They rode on, the encounter with Chester having created a subtle shift in their dynamic. The assumption that they were married had hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging it directly but both aware of how natural the misunderstanding had seemed. By the time they made camp that evening, Lilian couldn't ignore the growing tension. Their journey was nearly over, and they had yet to speak of what might come after. As they sat by the fire after their evening meal, she finally found the courage to broach the subject. "Hank, when we reach my uncle's tomorrow," she began, then faltered, unsure how to continue. "Yes," he prompted gently when she didn't go on. Lilian took a deep breath. "I find myself reluctant for our journey to end. These past days have been significant to me. You have become important to me." Hank's expression softened, hope and caution warring in his gaze. "Lilian, I know it's forward of me to speak so plainly," she rushed on, "and perhaps inappropriate given the circumstances of our meeting, but I would regret it deeply if I let you ride away without telling you how I feel." He moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Tell me," he urged softly. "Please." Looking into his eyes, Lilian found her courage. "I care for you, Hank, more than I thought possible in such a short time. The prospect of saying goodbye tomorrow fills me with a sadness I wasn't prepared for." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "I've been trying to find the right words to tell you the same thing," he admitted. "From the moment I found you in the desert, something about you called to me. Your courage, your intelligence, your kindness." He squeezed her hands gently. "These days with you have been the best of my life, Lilian." Joy bloomed in her chest, warm and bright. "Then perhaps we don't have to say goodbye tomorrow." "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "Stay," she said simply. "Not just tomorrow, but beyond that. Meet my uncle. See if Wasco might be a place you could call home." She hesitated. "See if we might have a future together." Hank raised one hand to gently touch her cheek. "Are you certain? Your life in Boston was so different from what I could offer you." "My life in Boston is past," Lilian said firmly. "I'm looking toward the future now, a future I've come to hope might include you." The firelight danced in his eyes as he leaned closer. "Lilian Evans, may I kiss you?" Her heart pounding, she nodded. "Yes, please." His lips met hers with gentle restraint that quickly gave way to deeper emotion as she responded eagerly to his embrace. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer, and Lilian felt as though everything in her life had been leading to this moment, this man, this place, this new beginning. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Hank pressed his forehead against hers. "I'll stay," he promised, "for as long as you'll have me." "That might be a very long time," she warned, happiness making her bold. His smile widened. "I'm counting on it." Morning came with a sense of anticipation neither had felt before. They broke camp efficiently, both eager to reach their destination. As they rode side by side through the fertile valley, the landscape grew increasingly cultivated fields of grain, orchards heavy with summer fruit, vineyards stretching across gentle slopes. "It's beautiful," Lilian remarked, taking in the abundance around them. "So different from the desert." "Different, but no less special," Hank agreed. "Each has its own kind of beauty." By mid-morning they spotted what had to be her uncle's property, an orchard of neat rows of apple trees surrounding a modest but well-maintained farmhouse. Just as Chester had described, a bright red barn stood prominently among the outbuildings. "That's it," Lilian said, a mix of excitement and nervousness in her voice. "My new home." Hank reached across to squeeze her hand briefly. "Ready?" She nodded, and they urged their horses forward down the long drive leading to the house. A man appeared on the porch as they approached, tall and lean, with graying hair and a weathered face that broke into a wide smile as he recognized his visitor. "Lilian," he called, hurrying down the steps to meet them. "My dear girl, you've made it at last. I was beginning to worry." Lilian dismounted quickly, moving into her uncle's welcoming embrace. "Uncle Thomas, it's so good to finally meet you." Thomas Evans held her at arm's length, studying her face with evident pleasure. "You look just like your mother. She would be so proud of the woman you've become." His gaze shifted to Hank, who had dismounted and was standing respectfully nearby. "And who is your companion?" "Uncle, this is Hank O'Malley," Lilian introduced, moving to stand beside Hank. "He saved my life when bandits attacked me on the trail. They shot my horse and left me stranded in the desert. Hank found me and has escorted me safely all the way from Arizona Territory." Thomas stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. O'Malley, it seems I owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude. Please, both of you, come inside. You must be exhausted from your journey." The farmhouse was comfortable and welcoming, with simple but well-crafted furniture and large windows that filled the rooms with light. Thomas ushered them into the kitchen where his housekeeper, a motherly woman named Mrs. Delgado, exclaimed over Lilian's travel-worn appearance and immediately set about preparing a proper meal. Over lunch, Lilian recounted their journey, including her encounter with the Larson gang and the harrowing days that followed. Thomas listened with growing concern. "These outlaws, do you think they might still pose a danger?" he asked Hank. "It's possible, but unlikely they'd follow all the way to California," Hank replied. "Still, it would be wise for the local sheriff to be aware of the situation." Thomas nodded grimly. "I'll speak with Sheriff Brooks tomorrow. In the meantime, Mr. O'Malley, I insist you stay with us. The bunkhouse is comfortable, and I'd welcome an extra hand around the orchard if you're willing." Hank glanced at Lilian, a silent communication passing between them. "That's very generous, Mr. Evans. I'd be happy to help while I'm here." "While you're here?" Thomas echoed, looking between them curiously. "Do you have other commitments drawing you away soon?" Lilian spoke up, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Uncle, there's something you should know. Hank and I, during our journey, we've grown very close. He's considering staying in Wasco, perhaps finding land of his own nearby." Understanding dawned on Thomas's face, followed by a knowing smile. "I see. Well, Mr. O'Malley, you're welcome to stay as long as you like. Any man who would risk his life for my niece deserves a fair chance to court her properly, if that's your intention." "It is, sir," Hank confirmed, a hint of color touching his cheekbones. "With your blessing." Thomas chuckled, rising to clap Hank on the shoulder. "Young man, you already have it. Now, let me show you both around the property. Lilian, you must see the improvements I've made since I wrote you last." The remainder of the day passed in a blur of introductions and explorations. Thomas proudly showed Lilian every aspect of the orchard operation. From the different varieties of apples, he grew to the small cidery he had recently established. Hank asked knowledgeable questions about the irrigation system and the challenges of the local climate, impressing Thomas with his practical understanding of agriculture. By the time Mrs. Delgado served a hearty dinner that evening, it felt to Lilian as if they had always been there, as if the dangerous journey that had brought them together was already becoming a story to be told rather than a fresh memory. Watching Hank and her uncle discuss the merits of different apple rootstocks, she felt a contentment she had not experienced since before her parents' deaths. Later, as twilight settled over the orchard, Lilian and Hank walked together among the trees, enjoying a moment of privacy after the busy day. "Your uncle is a good man," Hank observed. "I can see where you get your warmth and intelligence." Lilian smiled, linking her arm through his. "He seems quite taken with you as well. I think he's already planning to put you to work permanently." "Would that please you?" Hank asked, stopping to face her. "If I were to stay, not just as a visitor, but as part of your life here?" In the soft evening light, with the scent of ripening apples surrounding them, Lilian felt her heart expand with certainty. "More than anything," she admitted. "But what of your dreams of your own ranch? I wouldn't want you to abandon your plans for me." Hank reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "Dreams can change, Lilian, or rather they can grow to include new possibilities." His hand lingered on her cheek. "The truth is, I've spent years drifting, looking for a place that felt right. Now I realize what I was really searching for was someone to build a life with, not just a piece of land to call my own." Lilian leaned into his touch, overwhelmed by the love she saw in his eyes. "Then stay," she whispered. "Stay and build that life with me." His answer was in the kiss he gave her, tender at first, then deepening with a promise of all they could become together. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, the first stars had appeared in the darkening sky. "We should head back," Hank said reluctantly. Your uncle will be wondering where we've gone." They walked hand in hand toward the welcoming lights of the farmhouse, both knowing that their journey together was not ending but truly beginning. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm of their own. Hank proved himself invaluable around the orchard, his strength and practical knowledge complementing Thomas's experience. Lilian quickly established herself in the community, making friends and finding her place in the small but vibrant town of Wasco. Word of their dramatic meeting spread, as stories tend to do in small communities, and soon their courtship became something of a local legend. The Eastern lady and her cowboy rescuer, brought together by fate and danger, now building a life among the apple trees. Thomas, watching their love blossom, took Hank aside one evening while Lilian was visiting with neighbors. "I've seen the way you look at my niece," he said without preamble. "And more importantly, the way she looks at you. What are your intentions, son?" Hank met the older man's gaze steadily. "I love her, sir. I want to marry her if she'll have me, build a life together, give her the happiness she deserves." Thomas nodded satisfaction in his expression. "Good. That's what I hoped you'd say." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "This was my sister's, Lilian's mother, her wedding ring. I think she would want Lilian to have it and to see her daughter marry a man of character." Hank accepted the pouch with reverent hands. "Thank you, sir. This means more than I can express." "Just make her happy," Thomas said gruffly. "That's all the thanks I need." 2 days later, under the spreading branches of the oldest apple tree in the orchard, Hank knelt before Lilian and asked her to be his wife. With happy tears in her eyes, she accepted both his proposal and her mother's ring, which fit her finger as if it had been made for her. They were married in Wasco's small church on a crisp autumn day, with golden leaves carpeting the ground and the sweet scent of fall harvest in the air. The whole town turned out to witness the union of the couple whose story had captured their imaginations. Sheriff Brooks had received word just a week before the wedding that the Larson gang had been apprehended near the Mexican border, removing the last shadow from Lilian's new life. It seemed fitting that on the day she became Mrs. O'Malley, she could truly leave her fears behind. As Lilian and Hank exchanged their vows, she thought of the strange twist of fate that had brought them together, how the worst moment of her life had led, ultimately, to the best. The bandits who had shot her horse and left her for dead had unknowingly set her on the path to true happiness. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. And as Hank drew her into their first kiss as a married couple, Lilian knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Their reception was held at the orchard, with tables set up among the trees and lanterns casting a magical glow as evening fell. There was music and dancing, laughter and tears of joy. Thomas gave a touching toast to the couple, welcoming Hank officially into the family and expressing his belief that his sister and brother-in-law were smiling down on their daughter's happiness. Later, as Hank led Lilian in a dance beneath the stars, he pulled her close and whispered, "Happy, Mrs. O'Malley." "Completely," she assured him, resting her head against his shoulder. "And you, more than I ever thought possible," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "When I found you in that desert, I had no idea I was finding my future." "It seems we rescued each other," Lilian mused. "You saved me from death, and you saved me from a life half-lived," Hank finished, looking down at her with such love that it took her breath away. "A fair exchange, I'd say." As autumn gave way to winter, Lilian and Hank settled into married life in the small cabin Thomas had built for them on the orchard property. They worked side by side, learning the rhythms of the land and each other, their love deepening with each passing day. In the spring, they received word that Hank's sister would be visiting from San Francisco, eager to meet the woman who had captured her brother's heart. And shortly after that joyful reunion came even better news: Lilian was expecting their first child. "A baby," Hank whispered in wonder, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our child, growing right here." Lilian covered his hand with her own, happiness bubbling up inside her. "The beginning of our family, the next chapter of our story." Their son, James Thomas O'Malley, was born on a warm summer night, with Thomas pacing nervously outside and Hank holding Lilian's hand through every moment of labor. When the midwife placed the squalling infant in his father's arms, Hank's expression of awe and love was something Lilian knew she would remember until her dying day. "He's perfect," Hank murmured, carefully transferring their son to Lilian's waiting arms. "Just like his mother." Life settled into a new pattern, with James's arrival days marked by his milestones and the changing seasons of the orchard. Thomas doted on his grandnephew, teaching him the names of apple varieties as soon as the boy could speak. Over the next few years, the O'Malley family grew. A daughter, Catherine, joined them 2 years after James, followed by another son, William, 18 months later. The small cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family, with Hank adding rooms as they were needed. Thomas eventually stepped back from the day-to-day operation of the orchard, turning more responsibility over to Hank and Lilian, who proved to be natural partners in business as well as in life. Under their guidance, the orchard prospered and expanded, their products becoming known throughout the region for quality and innovation. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Hank surprised Lilian with a special gift: the deed to 20 acres adjoining the orchard, land he had been quietly purchasing in installments for years. "For our future," he explained as they stood on a rise overlooking the new property. "Room to grow, to try new crops, to build legacies for our children." Lilian, deeply moved by his thoughtfulness, wrapped her arms around him. "You've already given me everything I could want, Hank. A home, a family, a love I never thought possible." He kissed her then, with all the passion and tenderness of their first embraces, proving that time had only strengthened what had begun in those dangerous days on the trail from Arizona. Years passed, seasons turned, children grew. James followed in his father's footsteps, developing a natural affinity for the land and its care. Catherine revealed a sharp mind for business, while William showed artistic talent, capturing the beauty of the orchard in paintings that eventually hung in homes throughout California. Through it all, Hank and Lilian remained each other's anchors, their love a constant in a changing world. They weathered challenges together: droughts that threatened the crops, economic downturns, the inevitable losses that come with time. Thomas's passing, peaceful in his sleep at the age of 78, was mourned deeply but softened by the knowledge that he had lived to see his niece truly happy and the orchard flourishing under the next generation's care. On warm summer evenings, long after the children were grown with families of their own, Hank and Lilian still walked among the apple trees, hand in hand, sometimes reminiscing about their extraordinary beginning. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if those bandits hadn't shot your horse?" Hank asked one such evening as the setting sun painted the orchard in gold. "If we had never met," Lilian considered the question, leaning into his familiar strength. "Sometimes. But then I think perhaps we were always meant to find each other. Maybe not in that desert in that moment, but somehow, somewhere, our paths would have crossed." Hank smiled, pressing a kiss to her silver-streaked hair. "I like to think so too. That some things are written in the stars, inevitable no matter the circumstances." "Like us," Lilian said softly. "Inevitable." "Like us," he agreed, drawing her close as twilight settled over the orchard that had witnessed their love story from its beginning, a story that had started with bandits and a shared saddle. and blossomed into a lifetime of joy.